I'm joined live by London-based political activist John Rees. Well, Paris says it's waging a war against terrorism there in Mali, so its goals are noble, at least, aren't they?
Well, we've heard this so many times now. I'm surprised that they don't bore themselves by repeating this line. We heard it over Afghanistan, we heard it over Iraq, we heard it over Libya. And we should recall that right at the beginning of this process, more than a decade ago, the head of the security services in Britain warned the then Prime Minister Tony Blair that the interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq would spread the threat of terrorism, not reduce it. That warning has proved, sadly, absolutely correct. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq before we invaded it. There is now. Al-Qaeda had not spread to Pakistan in the way that it has now since the invasion of Afghanistan. As we've heard from your correspondent, the intervention in Libya has led directly to the spread of Al-Qaeda in Mali now. We should at least have learnt by now that this is not the way in which you reduce the threat of terrorism. It is actually a way in which you bolster it, in which you increase its attractiveness to young people in the region.
Well, what now, John? What do you do now? I mean, in effect, the genie is out of the bottle. Should France just sit back and let terrorism and extremism reign over Mali, where perhaps it could become a haven for extremist terrorists and not just threaten regional stability, but also become a base for terrorist operations worldwide? I mean, you've got to do something about it now, even though it's probably your fault in the first place.
Well, if the French want to do something about reducing the antagonism between their state and Muslim people, both in France and abroad, they should start at home. They should start withdrawing the laws which make it illegal for women to wear Islamic headdresses in France. They should withdraw the law which now makes it illegal for Muslims to pray in the street in France. Perhaps if they want to better relations with the Muslim world, they can start by bettering the relations with the Muslim community in France itself. That would be a far more significant step forward than bombing yet another Muslim country.
Now, African nations, when will they be left to solve their internal problems by themselves without foreign interference?
Well, I think when they stand up to the imperial powers, I think it's a mistake on the part of the Mali government, no matter what its difficulties, to call for help from the very people who are responsible since colonial times for so much of the disaster in that part of the world. Only a small look north and east would tell you that in the Middle East the constant attentions of the imperial powers have, generation after generation, worsened the problem, not made it better.
France is saying, of course, nationals are threatened there in Mali. What sort of response and support would it get from the French people? Do you think the French people will support this military campaign?
They may well do. I mean, I think your correspondent was right when they said that there is very little difference between Sarkozy's response over Libya and Hollande's response over the Mali crisis. That's sad, because Hollande promised so much. I imagine that it's actually his inability to deliver on the domestic front, his inability to live up to the high hopes that many in France had that he would deal with austerity, which has driven him to an increasingly reckless foreign policy in the hope that it will bolster his poll ratings. These gambles sometimes turn out to be correct, but in recent history in Europe they've often turned out to be incorrect. It was the end of the Blair prime ministership when he attacked Iraq. It took some years to work its way through, but that's what happened. Hollande needs to look at that and wonder whether or not he wants to tread the same path.
John, thanks very much for your thoughts. London-based political activist John Rees.